Okay, so a very warm welcome to this BioWednesday webinar, which is actually sitting within our Building Life Science Adventures 2022 Careers Conference. So we've just had a fantastic 2 days of panel discussions about building and accessing great careers within the life science sector. And I'm delighted to have such an esteemed panel to take us into this discussion on what's the best use of carbon in the life science sector. Now, of course, this is a very key topic across many industries, and our sector has a very key role in contributing to that as a global effort. And of course, it's probably no surprise that we're quite far from being as green as we can be, but that's why we're here today to discuss the initiatives and the practice tips that we can do to help that and the challenges along the way. So I'm delighted we have Karen Taylor, who is head of the Centre for Health Solutions at Deloitte, to guide our discussion. And I will shortly hand to Karen, and then each of the panel members will do an introduction to themselves too. So for all of the delegates who've dropped in, thank you so much. Please use this as an opportunity to drop your thoughts and comments into the chat box, because we'll be reserving some time throughout the discussion to take your thoughts as well. So we welcome your input to the discussion too. I am recording the session, so as with the BLSA content that's just been, it will be available to catch up on after the session as on demand. So with that, I'm going to hand to Karen to lead us into this discussion. I hope you enjoy, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to chair this panel, moderate this panel, whichever word you want to choose. In a pre-meeting that we had just to get to know each other a little bit, we did question whether we wanted to talk about what's the best use of carbon in the life sciences industry, or whether we should be talking more about how we can reduce carbon emissions generated by the sector. That I think we felt more comfortable, because what's the best use is a very, very difficult question to answer. But hopefully in answering the latter, we will give you some answers to the former. Before we start, as already been said, I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves, plus a quick idea about the focus of their interest in carbon reduction. And then we'll have some questions and answers, or we'll have some panel discussion, I should say. And then, as Alicia said, I'll leave time at the end for you to answer any of your questions before concluding. So thank you for joining us. And without further ado, if we could ask, and we could start with Professor Jason Snape, please.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So I'm Jason Snape. I'm the Global Head of Environment within AstraZeneca. I've worked for AstraZeneca for 27 years, so more than half my life. I have accountability and responsibility for the whole of our environmental protection strategy, and that covers a number of themes. One of those is actually delivering our climate strategy, so to be carbon zero across scopes 1 and scope 2 by the end of 2025, net zero by 2045, but an interim goal to actually be carbon negative by 2030. So remove more carbon from the atmosphere than we emit on that journey between 2030, 2035. I also have to build in climate resilience actually into our operations and our supply chain. So actually looking at the physical risks that climate change poses to our assets, making sure that we put the investments in place to ensure that medicines get to patients and there's no barriers from climate over that period of time. But also climate change poses transitional risks and opportunities to our business as the healthcare sector and the broader life science sector look to transition to a low carbon economy. So it's making sure that we're seeing where the healthcare opportunities exist to deliver low carbon care, but also where the risks are in our portfolio. Then aside from carbon, I've got accountability for our water strategy, our waste and our circularity strategy, but also our product design. So it's ensuring that the products that we're building actually have the lowest environmental and natural resource footprint possible. So obviously patients deserve medicines that don't cost the earth. And then when medicines are being manufactured or being used by patients, it's ensuring that we're managing proactively the issues associated with pharmaceutical residues in the environment, because many of the drug targets in humans are also present in aquatic life. So it's taking quite a holistic view of the life sciences sector within the pharmaceutical industry in terms of its natural resource footprint, both at a site and supply chain level, but also at a product level, and proactively managing the risks of our medicines across that life cycle, including the patient use element, and then trying to innovate wherever we can to deliver better patient outcomes, actually with a lower environmental footprint. So I'll stop there, Karen.
Thanks, Jason. Jo, would you like to go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jo Durgan. I'm a senior postdoc at the Babram Institute, where my research is focused on autophagy, but I have a parallel role chairing our Green Labs sustainability initiative at the Institute. The aim of Green Labs is to address our environmental footprint that's associated with our research, but also with other aspects of our work on campus and our work life. So within the labs, we look at areas such as energy use, water use, and waste. And then in the wider workplace, we're thinking about areas such as staff commuting, the impact of conference travel, areas such as finance, so investments and pensions, and also things like food and catering across the campus. Outside of work, I'm also a member of the Climate Reality Project, which is a global organisation which is focused on raising awareness of the climate crisis and catalysing solutions.
Thanks, Jo. James, I'm going along the top of my list who I can see photos. So James, do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. My name is James Conley. I'm the CEO of My Green Lab. My Green Lab is a global nonprofit organization with a mission to build a culture of sustainability in science. We do that primarily through our flagship My Green Lab certification program, and it's great to meet you, Jason, and AstraZeneca, among many other large biotech and pharma companies, have committed to pursuing My Green Lab certification, and in fact are pursuing it across a number of their facilities all over the world. We also run a certification for laboratory products called the ACT label, which works at helping to reduce the carbon impact of the lab supply chain, as well as the other environmental impacts of the lab supply chain. I joined the organization around 2 years ago in the CEO role, although I had been serving on the board and advising the organization previously. And over the past 2 years, we've really seen just sort of an explosion in the understanding and awareness of the environmental impact of research, and just a huge movement and groundswell of people interested, both grassroots efforts like the one that was just described, as well as top-down efforts from companies to drive green labs across the industry. One thing I'll mention before handing it over is My Green Lab at COP26 last year produced a report trying to quantify and wrap our arms around the total carbon impact of the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. And we used that first report, looked at publicly traded companies and their publicly reported data, and we found some pretty surprising findings, that the carbon impact of biotech and pharma was actually very significant, actually larger than the semiconductor industry, which I think showed a bit of the scope of the problem. Only looking at public companies, when we add in private companies, government institutions, academic labs, it's actually much larger. And then we also found that a significant part of that carbon footprint, which companies like Jason's that have been dealing with this for quite a long time already knew, but I think maybe brought on the collective consciousness, is really in the supply chain. And that supply chain is an incredibly important focus if we're going to drive down the carbon of the industry. So we offer tools and programs and strategies and produce research to help understand and find key leverage points to reduce the carbon impact and other environmental impacts of the industry. So thank you. Well, glad to be here.
Thank you, James. Ross, you're next on my list.
Yep, thanks, Karen. Yeah, hello, everybody. So a little bit different, I guess. So my name is Ross Overman. I'm a principal scientist in process development working for Leaf Expression Systems Limited. So we're a small SME based on the Norwich Research Park. So my background is large pharma. So I used to work for AstraZeneca, funnily enough, for about 16 years. But I joined Leaf in 2018. So we're kind of coming at this slightly differently. So in terms of what we do as the SME, we haven't got certain environmental goals or anything like that, but what we do bring is an alternative way to make small molecules and make proteins, I guess, which we're hoping at scale can be a more environmentally friendly way, hopefully with lower greenhouse gas emissions, those types of things, to produce these molecules and to think a little bit differently, I guess, as compared to what most of large pharma does currently in terms of producing these types of molecules. So we're still at very early stages. There are companies that do this. And one thing I wanted to mention, so last week, there's a company in Canada, so Medicargo, has had approval from the Canadian Medical Authority to release the first COVID vaccine that's been made entirely in plants. So it's a whole plant system. It's the first human therapeutic that's been made in plants as well. So it's a very early stage compared to where the most companies are at the moment, but it's an interesting field, and hopefully I'll tell you a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Ross. And last but not least, Yoko. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Hi, my name is Yoko Shibata. I am leading a preclinical material production team at a small biotech company called PetMedics in Cambridge. So what I do is something comes before Ross's job. So it's between R&D and further upstream process development type. So PetMedics is a small, becoming a medium-sized biotech company, and we situated in Babraham Institute where Joe is. And as for my background, I did my PhD in US and I joined MRC LMB as the postdoc. Since then, I worked at AstraZeneca / MedImmune for 5 years or so, followed by CRUK Alliance Laboratory before joining to PetMedics. I'm hoping that I can bring in that perspective of knowing both larger side and very small biotech side and the difficulty we face. Basically, we cannot do what the larger company can do. So our focus has to be more of the reduction of waste, efficiency, and maybe a better recycling strategy rather than focusing on really net zero type of thing. But of course, the not doing anything is not an option. So here I am trying to increase the awareness in the company. And we also joined the Green Impact Scheme alongside of the Babraham Institute this year. So we are trying to do whatever we can, as little it might be, to reduce our carbon footprint.
Thank you, Yoko. So I'm going to come to James Connolly first. I better say the surnames, given we have James and a Jason. I could get them mixed up if I'm not careful. And your report that you just mentioned, yes, you compared the biotech and biopharma industry to other industries, and you've just mentioned the sensors industry, but you also cover scope one, 2, and 3. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about what your findings in the comparative findings between scopes 1 and 2 and scope 3.
Sure. So the report looked at both aggregate carbon impact for scope 1, 2, and 3, as well as carbon intensity, so carbon per unit of revenue. And the biotech and pharmaceutical industry does have a relatively high carbon intensity, so carbon impact per unit of revenue. And when we dug into the scope 3 emissions of the industry, actually, which is pretty typical for most industries, the majority of the overall carbon impact is in scope 3. And biotech and pharma is about 4.7 times larger than scope 1 and scope 2. Within scope 3, we found that purchased goods and services, as well as use of sold goods and services, were the main drivers of carbon impact. Purchased goods and services, all the things that a company is buying upstream, and then use of sold goods, the impact or the carbon impact of all the things that they're producing downstream. I would say the industry, there's actually some kind of interesting parts of that scope 3 emissions for biotech and pharma. For example, for companies like GSK and AstraZeneca, the inhalers and the high global warming potential gases from inhalers are actually a pretty significant part of that, those downstream emissions, things that they're working on tackling pretty rapidly. But it is not completely dissimilar from other industries and the findings that we found. I think that what we were excited to see as well is that some of the leading companies like AstraZeneca are taking some very, very aggressive leadership roles, and they're setting ambitious carbon targets actually aligned with a 1.5 degree world, just like Jason described. While the leading companies are driving that forward, unfortunately, what we found is the rest of the industry isn't really following behind as quickly as they need to. And we actually found that the top 15 and top 25 companies were reducing their carbon impact year on year, but the rest of the companies looked at in our study, over 67 other companies actually were growing their carbon impact, and that the industry itself was expanding by 15% year on year. So, it's a significant carbon emitter, and it needs to be part of the climate solution. I think the silver lining is that the leading companies are showing the way. We just need to get the rest of the industry to follow in their footsteps.
Thank you, James. That's one of the things I found really quite startling, was the actual trends. Given there's been a lot of focus on the initiatives to reduce, but the trending going upwards is something that the industry as a whole needs to tackle. If I could come to Joanna, and as chair of Green Labs and the Barbaram Institute initiative, you aim to tackle sustainability in our labs. Can you explain a little bit about what the challenges and opportunities you see in doing that?
Sure. So we take quite a diverse approach to this, as I mentioned in the introduction, looking at a range of different areas. And I'd say the most obvious opportunity that comes up is the potential for saving money. So that was, as a first step into this, that was my approach, as how to sell it to my colleagues. So taking energy efficiency as an example, we focus on that heavily as some of the initial steps of our sustainability work. And this can be at the level of the site, or it can be at the level of the labs and the equipment. So on a site level, one of the energy efficiency measures that we've taken in recent years is the installation of a tri-generator, which combines cooling and heating and power generation. And that's had a really significant impact on our ability to be energy efficient, makes a big saving in terms of carbon emissions. And of course, if you're using energy more efficiently, then you're spending less on your energy bills. So that's kind of a no-brainer in a research setting where we're always trying to make the best use of our funding. At a kind of more focused level in the lab, we take a similar approach, thinking about how we can best use equipment. So an important example there would be changing the set point on our low temperature freezers from -80 to -70. Which for the most part is absolutely fine in terms of sample preservation, but saves on energy use by about 25%. And given that even in a setting like ours, we have multiple freezers and each one of them is using about the same amount of energy as a couple of households, the collective impact of that simple change is really quite significant. And then we can go even on a more focused level and start thinking about simple things like turning equipment off when it's not in use. So the kind of steps that you may readily take at home that don't always get taken in the workplace because of bad habits and kind of culture, we try to advocate to our staff to be more mindful of some of those things, again with the advantage being that it saves money to plough back into our research. Another area that we think about increasingly is waste. How can we reduce the amount of things that we use? how can we consolidate orders to make sure that we're not being wasteful in terms of packaging and shipments, and the miles associated with things being delivered to us. We also do quite a lot of work in recycling, and it's complicated. That in a research setting, you're constantly having to make sure that any sustainability measures you take don't compromise either on the research or on health and safety issues. And so we have to think quite carefully about each measure we take, but by trying to think about the types of items that get used most heavily and how single actions can target those things, that's proved to be quite effective. So as an example, we focused simply on the plastic bottles in which tissue culture media is delivered, and asked our estates team, is there a way that we could have those be recycled rather than incinerated? We've been able to create a new waste stream to make that possible, and it's thousands and thousands of bottles every year which are now being diverted to recycling just in one institute. And by sharing information on how we're making that happen, we hope that we can amplify our impact and allow other institutes who use even more of those bottles to do the same thing. Our campus is a little bit unusual in that it's set in a very green, beautiful setting. And so another kind of recycling action that we're able to take that may not be possible elsewhere is to compost the waste from our animal house. So all of the organic waste from the mouse house gets processed in a bespoke compost system and then used directly to fertilize the surrounding land. So in that way, we're actually enriching the soil around us by making use of that waste. So those are sort of some of the lab-based actions that we've been taking, but we do also try to be mindful of the fact that just in the course of doing our jobs, there are also environmental impacts. So staff commuting is pretty significant. We're set a few miles outside of Cambridge, and so most of the staff would need to drive here. So one thing that we've done is make sure that everybody has access to a commuter bus pass so that they can have subsidised public transport. We have EV charging points on site, and there's an intention to increase the availability of those. I think conference flights for scientists is a really significant area to think about. This is something that's been quantified in some publications, and the impact of a single large meeting is about, I think it's equivalent to traveling the distance between the Earth and the Sun. So doing that every time that we decide to travel to a meeting as a community, we kind of have to ask ourselves whether that's reasonable or not. And so we're trying to just raise awareness of that with our scientists and think about whether people could participate in a hybrid meeting more often, switch from a plane to a train, at least for short haul journeys, and at least carbon offset flights that are unavoidable. And similarly, we're starting to explore other areas such as finance. So thinking about fossil fuel divestment is an important area for companies and public organisations like ours, and also helping our staff to make ethical selections when it comes to pension funds. If that's something that they're interested in doing, we'd like to be able to provide them with information to facilitate that. And so that's really how we're trying to pair up work very focused in the lab with thinking about the wider workplace at Babram.
Well, there's a huge amount of food for thought there for everyone to think about, and of course, we would normally find us be in in the past, we would have been in a conference room ourselves. So I'm sure it's what every organisation is looking at, the need for that travel. Of course, you do lose out on certain things. Yoko, maybe I could just bring you in there on the issue of plastics, and in particular, you say that in science labs, some use of plastics is just unavoidable. But how can we do better at reducing waste and lowering the carbon footprint in the R&D space?
Sure. So if I go back like a decade or so, when it first came to UK, it was beginning of 2000, and at MRC, many things were actually glassware. They were washed and reused. Somewhere from then to 10 years later, the whole industry become like a consumer of one single-use sterile plastic. And there is a reason for it, because for us, the most important part of our job is the safety, whether the subject is the animal or the humans. That has to, I mean, even before the medicine's efficacy, we have to think about the safety first. For that reason, sometimes reusing the glassware might or might not be the best solution. So the reason is there, but then we went to the other extreme and everything became plastic. So I only have a relatively old number, but in 2015, researchers at the University of Exeter weighed up their biosciences department's waste for a whole year and then extrapolated it and came up to the number 5.5 million tons of plastic waste a year from the biopharmaceutical industry alone. Now that's basically completely offset the plastic recycle in 2012. So that is a large number. And I also have contacted a student, then a PhD student, David Kunding. He was in, Jennifer's lab at the University of York. He was determined to reduce the plastic waste, single-use plastic waste. So their lab decided to experiment. So they use the plastic, they clean, they talk to the CRO so that they will take back the plastic. So, so they decided on the condition how they can sort, they can take back, how clean it has to be, what kind of clean decontamination process they have to do. But they did that for a year, and a small lab of about a dozen people saved about 1 ton of plastic waste in a year. So that's, again, a huge number. That means that we can actually do that. We can recycle waste or reduce the waste. Now, at the moment, I think our focus has to be, first of all, reduce the usage to start with. So in our lab, we actually went back to the glass bottles. So if we don't have to think about, if it is the R&D stage material we have to provide, so it's going into test tubes and tissue culture, then we use glassware. So they get wet washed and we use it again. Only time we strictly have to use sterile plastic is when we have to do something with animals. Again, it's because of the safety consideration. And then we try to recycle as much as we can. Now we are in the same campus as Joe, and we are very, very lucky to be there because the campus already has the amazing waste stream management as well as a recycling scheme. So we can pretty much recycle any clean plastic. So any chemical bottles, any media bottles, the buffer bottles, we do have to rinse, but then they can all get recycled. Any wrapping material, all the sterile plastic comes in from the vendor, they can be recycled. And yes, so those are things we focus on in order to reduce the plastic and plastic waste, so that we don't end up with burying the earth with lots of plastics, or having the plastic going into the oceans, making a strange big island we don't have.
Yeah. Jason, I'm going to change it up slightly and just change direction a little bit. Because when I looked at sort of what you were saying, I've got a quote here that you wrote in your bio. We don't just want to transition existing NHS care to net zero. We can disrupt and innovate much more. So given that breadth and depth of experience that you've had in your years with AstraZeneca and working with the health system, what are the key steps that people need to take to do that?
I think for me, you've got to focus on your area in the first instance. So we've got scientists that are very, very engaged with my green labs. So I think we're somewhere in the region of about 36 labs across 31 sites, and 12 of them, I think, are gold or better in terms of some of the rankings. And I think we've won the Freezer Challenge. So we've got that sustainability mindset built in our R&D community. But actually, we've also got it within our pharmaceutical development and technology team as well, which is scaling up kind of those medicines to actually the clinical scale and practice. And that the pharma industry is seen quite often to be a very clean precision industry, but the reality is our resource efficiency is quite low. So you're probably taking quite often 150, maybe 500 kilograms of actually raw material to make 1 kilogram of an active substance. In many instances, actually that greenhouse gas footprint actually sits with the solvents. So there's a lot of innovation on green chemistry that we have to go and look at some of the innovations on kind of non-fossil based alternatives coming through. So in my role, we're looking to kind of break our reliance on fossil fuels for heat and power, but we've got to break that reliance in terms of how we make our drugs as well with bio-based alternatives. And we can do that to drive down the footprint of AstraZeneca. We can drive down the footprint of our products wherever possible. But actually, you also have to innovate and look at the current landscape of care as well. So our footprint is just one small part of a bigger whole system and a pathway. So we've got the NHS, the first healthcare provider to declare a climate emergency. They're setting expectations on their supply chain that if your climate targets aren't as progressive as theirs, they're not going to source from you. They're not going to do business with you. So everybody has to step up. But actually, a lot of the innovations that we've got coming through in the R&D labs and coming through the biosector at the moment actually can change the point of care from actually being in a hospital context to actually bring it from home. If we're getting innovations in precision medicine, where the current standard of care may be quite broad treatment, you actually can target things to populations that are going to respond. So actually you don't need as much medicine, the same as antibody drug conjugates. But actually, rather than treat those people that are actually affected quite late on and move to cure rather than prevention, actually, if you take a more holistic look to say, well, what disease prevention strategies are there? How can we diagnose disease earlier on? What clinical interventions can we do with more innovative medicines that will actually change that point of care, reduce the need for surgery, reduce the need for dialysis, reduce the need maybe for some asthma related products that have a bigger footprint? You can take that systems level of view. So not only look at clinical efficacy and safety, but actually look at environmental footprint when you're delivering care. So we work quite closely with some healthcare professionals, but also the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition, mapping out existing footprints of care. We will have the life cycle assessment, we will have the carbon, water, natural resource footprint of our products, and we can see whether or not we can deliver better outcomes to patients with a lower environmental footprint. So you're trying to create win-wins, so something that's actually better for the patient, but also better for the planet. And in many instances, it's probably also financially favourable as well. And I know in some of the discussions that we've had with the sustainability group within the NHS, it is about revisiting care in a low carbon world. And actually that brings some risks for high footprint medicines and pathways that are maybe inefficient. But actually there are lots of opportunities to innovate, disrupt, and actually challenge what we've got in place at the moment. And I think probably one of the best examples that you can maybe give will be through the COVID pandemic. So clearly there will be a greenhouse gas footprint associated with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the Moderna, the Pfizer one. But actually, if you can look at the clinical benefits and the societal benefits that that medicine's actually brought in terms of patients actually not falling ill or being as ill, that's had a massive saving actually on the greenhouse gas footprint, as well as the resources, the wider resources actually on our healthcare systems, without people having to go in for hospitalisation, less people actually going into intensive care, which actually has a financial drain, but actually an environmental drain on those resources. So I think looking at preventive care, be it vaccines, be it early diagnosis, early intervention, I think there are a lot of opportunities to innovate within the labs, recognise those innovations in the labs are going to get scaled up and actually deliver, and they're going to come with wider societal, environmental and economic benefits. So I think it's trying to start in the lab, but actually look at it, what you're doing in that broader systems context and what values that can bring over the existing standards of care there, as well as how you're operating in the lab to get that footprint down. So yes, you can do your bit locally, but actually if you think more holistically, the impact you can have can really, really amplify.
Thanks, and I know, like Deloitte, you AstraZeneca and Deloitte are founding members of the Sustainable Medicines Partnership, which then takes you into the waste of medicines that aren't being used and all of the issues around that. So really, the scope is incredibly broad, but also very exciting because it's benefiting patients as well as reducing the carbon footprint. So I'm sure there'll be some questions on that later, but Ross, can I just turn to you, having first of all worked for a large company, AstraZeneca, and now as an SME, what do you see are the different both challenges and opportunities that you face in this space?
Yeah, and it is very different as well, because I remember my time at AstraZeneca, you had a dedicated person that would deal with this and a dedicated person would deal with that. And, you know, you can really put a lot of effort into these initiatives. I think when you come to a small company, and we're about 13 people now, it's difficult to resource somebody dedicated to looking after the environmental aspect and this aspect and that aspect. That doesn't mean to say that we don't try and do something. So we obviously, we recycle as much as we can, cardboard and those types of things. We're washing glassware, try to cut down on plastic waste as much as possible. Our energy supplier is 100% renewable energy supplier, that type of thing, which is obviously important. One thing that really strikes me is I'm sitting in a building here that was built in 2015. There are no solar panels on the roof of this building. There's no heat recovery source in this building. There's no rainwater recycling, all these types of things that should be nowadays put into these new buildings that just aren't there. I guess in terms of specifics, in terms of the things that are kind of difficult for us. So we have a small catalog of products currently. These are kind of testers for people to use. We made the decision very early on that we would lyophilize those products rather than freeze them and then ship them on dry ice, because obviously there's a huge difference in cost in terms of the environment and also in terms of cost for a small business as well. So that's one very simple thing that we decided to do. We're a bit different in the sense that we make things using plants, so there are very plant-specific things that we can do. So plants obviously require light, and that's not 24 hours a day here in the UK, so we have to use LEDs. Obviously, it's a low carbon light source as well. We're moving to biodegradable pots, so you typically grow plants in plastic pots. That's not sustainable for the future, so we're moving to biodegradable opportunities for that. And I'm hoping that kind of biodegradable plastic thing will transfer to other areas of the lab as well. And I'm sure there are companies that are making these types of things at the moment. And the other thing that we do, even at the scale that we're working at, I guess, is all of our plant waste is biodegraded. So it's taken off to a local council recycling centre and mixed with all the other plant waste. So it's recycled in that respect. So there's lots of things that we can do. I think the thing that's good about a small company where you don't have a team to kind of enforce these things is that it's very easy to disseminate that. We're going to change this, we're going to change that, and get compliance as well within the company, because you can quite easily see who's doing stuff and who's not doing things. So there are challenges, but there are certainly advantages as well to being in a small company, I think.
Great. James, do you think the industry is going far enough and fast enough in its ambition?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. You know, I mentioned earlier that our study found that actually only 4% of companies within the group of biotech and pharma companies that we looked at had carbon targets that were aligned with a 1.5 degree world. And only 40% of companies had targets at all. So if you look in aggregate, I think the industry is not does not have ambitious enough targets, and it's not moving quickly enough. However, I do want to mention the silver linings that I talked about before. That's so great to have so many leaders that are pushing forward sustainability within their companies, and organizations like AstraZeneca that are really demonstrating true leadership to the market. My Green Lab's Green Lab certification was selected as a breakthrough outcome for the UN Race to Zero in October. So they're not only setting long-term outcomes to be net zero by 2050 or sooner, they're asking particular industries to establish short-term goals. What are you doing now to drive change and transformation? That's going to be a key leverage point to shift the entire industry. They selected My Green Lab certification for now as a key leverage point for biotech and pharma, as well as medtech, because it's a way to get the entire company and all the scientists aligned around the organization's environmental goals. It's not the end game, it's just one waypoint, and there's more, as Jason mentioned, we need to do around efficiency, around purchasing, around using fossil fuels, and then more broadly along care pathways and how medicines are delivered and all along the upstream supply chain. But that's a key leverage point that we think could lead to a shift and transformation of the industry. And we're now in discussions now with biotech and pharma companies across the spectrum that are actually setting that goal. By 2030, they're going to reach 95 or 100% of them, their labs being green lab certified. So I think there's kind of a exponential growth trend, and we're reaching a tipping point where the whole industry is going to shift quite rapidly. So while looked at aggregate, you might come to sort of a negative or pessimistic view that we're not moving farther fast enough. I think we see some clear signs that there are leading companies that are moving fast enough, and that will create a change in tipping point where the whole industry will change. And it's so great to be among so many leaders that are driving forward that change today.
That's great. Jason, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, it was just going back to obviously there are a number of companies that have got those science-based targets, but obviously last year the Science Based Targets Initiative actually launched its new corporate net zero standard. And actually that's not just about having a climate strategy that's aligned to the 1.5 degree pathway, it's about how you're delivering against that pathway, which is more important. So that focus is predominantly now on elimination, reduction, substitution, and you're limited across all three scopes to actually offsets or compensation at about 10%. So it is forcing the decarbonisation. So we were in that first group of 7 companies globally to have our climate strategy verified against that. But it's also how you amplify things across your value chain. So aligned with the sustainability report that we had published last week, we were being quite clear, like the NHS is to its suppliers, unless 95% of our suppliers have got, unless our suppliers by spend have got science-based targets by the end of 2025, we're not going to be doing business with them. So it's amplifying that through, and then it's also providing supplier-based power purchase agreements to help your suppliers actually on that journey to net zero, where you've got 10 pharma companies actually partnering with an energy provider to actually help suppliers actually come through. So yes, you have to make your own targets, but actually you've also got to bring your suppliers with you and actually find a new way of doing business across that value chain. And the NHS is doing it with its suppliers, and we're also doing it with our own.
Can I just remind the audience that you can put any questions you've got in the chat. There's still sort of 10 minutes or so to be able to ask any of the panelists a question, so do get typing. In the meantime, I'm just going to go to Jo and ask her, could you say something a little bit more about the Global Climate Reality Project and how you're raising awareness of the climate crisis and catalysing its solutions?
Sure. So joining the Climate Reality Project was actually the first step I took in towards working on sustainability. I was on a personal level concerned about the environment. I wanted to learn more and try to understand what I might be able to do. And that was actually the first step that I took in 2017, was to go to one of their training events. So it's a global organization. It's led by Al Gore, who you may remember as the former vice president in the US, who in the years since leaving politics has been a really prominent campaigner for awareness on climate change. And the way it works is that you go to one of their training events. You spend a few days learning from some really world-class climate scientists and communicators, politicians, and so on. And the idea is that you agree to go back to your community and take 10 actions related to raising awareness of climate change or catalyzing solutions. And that they can be anything that you choose related to your work or your life. And so really it was having gone through that process of training that I came back and I started to think about the workplace as a really good niche for me to target. I think working at the level of an organization has some real benefits. It obviously scales up the impact you can make quite significantly from an individual level, but it's much quicker and easier to influence than things like government and national policies. So I think that's the real advantage that the organization brings. And they train thousands of people every year from all across the world. And so that's another really nice aspect of it, is that it allows you to join this network of people from all across the world and from all different walks of life, trying to catalyze solutions in a range of different ways. So one common action that people take is giving talks. So going into either their workplace or their local communities and giving talks to people, or other people choose to take much more practical actions. It's really open to you to interpret how you like. But for me, focusing on the workplace has been a really good way to take action.
Thanks. Ross, I did mention this to you earlier, but I just wonder, you previously worked in early phase discovery, and what we're seeing and have seen certainly in the last few years is a real increase in the use of AI in drug discovery, and just wondered what your take is on how that is contributing, or its potential to contribute to reducing the carbon footprint.
Yeah, I think it's got a big part to play. Well, the original title of this was "Where do we put our carbon resource?" And if you take all the information, all the knowledge, and all these things that are out there, and you use computers and the intelligence that's out there in the computer world to try and work out what are the best ways and the most efficient ways of doing things. I mean, Jason mentioned that trying to think of different ways to make compounds so that you don't do 10 different synthetic steps in a pathway to make a particular medicine. From where we are, we're trying to do that in plants essentially, and get the plant to do all the hard work. I mean, it's difficult because what you've got to do is you've got to start with the end in mind essentially. So you've got to work out where you need to get to. You've got to have compound libraries that are whereby you can quickly and easily and cheaply and with the lowest carbon footprint try and make those compounds and make different variants of them to bind specific targets better and do all the things you need to do to make a drug at the end of the day. But there are lots of different ways. So using synthetic biology to map pathways, and you can do this in plants, you can do this in fungi, you can do this in bacteria. There are much more efficient ways to make the drugs at the end of the day. And like you were saying, in terms of solvent use and that type of stuff, a lot of the information is already out there. So using computer power to work out the most efficient ways to do things, I think would be a fantastic thing to start. I know when I was there, so AZ was using biocatalysis, so they were starting to dip into that kind of area, which is great for certain steps. But what you really want to do is think about the entire molecule from the start. Before you even start screening something, you need to work out how you're going to make it at scale, what's the most efficient way of doing it. So I think if you can use AI and that type of thing to work out what these efficient pathways are before we even do it, and that applies across the whole gamut of things. What's the quickest and cheapest, lowest carbon way of getting X to Y geographically? There's a lot that can be done there, which we don't currently do. So yeah, I think that's where I would put my money if I wanted to try and influence this, is to kind of joined up thinking and get as much information in one place to do that and to make those decisions.
Thanks. We do have a question from our audience. Thanking you all for the interesting discussion, but a question about regulation, and often regulation is used as the reason why we can't do things or change things up, or that they'll stand in the way. So does regulation get in the way for the biological manufacturing of compounds in terms of having products of sufficient purity for healthcare? I don't know is there someone particularly like to take that question first? I mean, you must all have a view on the regulatory aspects of some of the things you've been talking about.
Yeah, I can pick up on the broader regulatory kind of question. And yeah, we are a heavily regulated industry. And if we're generating hazardous waste, then clearly we've got very, very prescribed ways in which we have to dispose of that waste. And that's not just the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's the healthcare sector as a whole, no matter what they're using, be it kind of sharps, disposables, to various things within a healthcare setting. And if it's dictated it's got contamination, be it biological or chemical, then it may have to go off for incineration at that point. So it's looking maybe to challenge, to embrace circularity a little bit more where we can, where we're not compromising safety, or if things ultimately have to go off for incineration, it's making sure they're captured with heat recovery or something else actually from within it. But if regulation's not fit for purpose, then we have to stand up and challenge that. And as you say, in terms of the bio-based things, then clearly we do have to limit that variability to ensure that we've got good quality control, good quality assurance, and we're not compromising kind of safety there. But it should be an area that actually we can limit, because some biological reactions actually might be more specific than actually some of the chemical reactions, in terms of some of the racemic mixtures that may come from chemistry that you may not get out of biology. So I think there'll be some areas where it may be a confounding factor. In other areas, some biological interventions can actually produce probably chemicals of optical purity. So might be swings and roundabouts.
Has anyone got anything to add on that? Well, we've got sort of coming up to the hour. We've got 7 minutes left. What I would like to do, if we've got no more questions from the audience, is to just give you each an opportunity to give one key takeaway that you'd like people to remember most from what you said, or maybe something you haven't said yet, but you want them to take away, so that everybody can do their bit in reducing the carbon footprint of the industry. And maybe if we start with James.
Great. You know, and I kind of mentioned this before in my previous comments, and maybe I'll just reinforce the point, but everybody has a critical role to play in reducing the carbon impact of science. And I think that often it can seem sort of overwhelming, or like your individual contributions don't make a difference. I will say that in our experience, often our relationship with an organization will start by an interested scientist that recognizes that there's a big environmental impact of their work, and they start trying to do something about it. They'll find out about us, they'll find out there's a program they could advocate for within their organization, and then that program starts to get adopted and maybe even becomes part of the organization's overall environmental strategy. And we see that happen time and time again. So I think everybody has a critical role to play, advocating, educating your colleagues, adopting programs and tools like ours, even getting your manufacturing community, the people you're purchasing products from, to be knowledgeable about the impact of their products, and pushing them to use tools like our ACT label. And those small changes and this small grassroots movement is now growing into a big global force through the Global Green Lab movement. And we'd encourage everybody to join and get involved and make a difference through their individual actions and their own job role.
Thank you, James. If we go to Yoko next.
So I think I might be repeating similar thing as James, but I think educating here is the very important thing. It's basically a behavioral change. So talk to your colleagues, talk to your neighbors, talk to everybody around, talk to your CEO. I mean, I talked about plastic waste since I interviewed for the company, and now that delivering the Green Impact Scheme end goal is actually a company goal this year. So by speaking out, talking to people, and also show as the example, good example, I think it will make a difference. And every little count. I mean, we can't reduce the carbon net zero in our company, but then that doesn't mean that we don't have to contribute reducing it.
Thank you. Ross, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's occurred to me while everyone's been speaking. There's lots of little things you can do, as everyone said. I think what I'm going to try and do, even within our lab, is to maybe set aside half a day, an afternoon, whether it's a Friday or something, and just take a walk, a wander around all the different labs, and just try and find things that we can do that are fairly low impact on what we have to do as in a role, but will make a difference, I guess. And if we do that and kind of review that every month or something like that, there's always opportunities you can find to try and reduce waste and try and reduce energy use and those types of things. So that's what I'd encourage everybody listening to do, and I'm going to try and do it myself as well.
Okay, Joe, you had lots of practical examples that you were already doing. What is your one key takeaway?
Yeah, I think it echoes a lot of what the others have said so far, really. But the way I see it, the climate crisis has a lot of different causes, but it also has a lot of different solutions. And really following on from what Ross just mentioned there, I think whatever of those solutions it is that you can identify or connect with, just get on and do something towards it. And I think these things have a habit of building up some momentum. And on a related note, a lot of the solutions that we would think of to help towards averting the climate crisis have a lot of other co-benefits as well. So I mentioned in earlier part of the session the obvious advantage of saving money through energy efficiency. There's also the importance that reducing carbon emissions and pollution is very important from a health perspective as well. The climate crisis is thought to be the biggest threat to health in the coming century. So it would be kind of contradictory for us all to be working in the healthcare sector and inadvertently be contributing to a problem that will diminish our health. So I think it's really important to emphasize the co-benefits of some of these things and think of it more as an opportunity to do something good than a kind of sacrifice to be made on our time or resources.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've just published a report on public health, which covers that exact subject. Jason, last word to you.
Yeah, and I think it's just reiterating what the others have said, that actually the climate crisis is a public health and an environmental health emergency that we're all facing, but actually it's the actions that we take as individuals day in, day out, across all labs, across all remits, that are going to amplify up to make a difference. So it's about having that sustainability mindset, challenging what you do. If you don't know the footprint of something you're doing, try and find out about it. If you don't know the credentials of actually who you're sourcing your goods or services from, challenge your procurement teams. At the end of the day, the consumer is the person with the power, and you've got that power to make change. And then don't lose sight of the systems level. So actually think about your individual activity and how that can amplify up and challenge things at that systems level. Because it's when you get to scale you make a difference. So yeah, it's think globally but act locally, I think would be my concluding message.
Well, that's fantastic, everybody. Really appreciated your participation in the panel. Some really great ideas, covered a lot of ground, gave me a huge amount of food for thought. I'm just designing a research piece into sustainability and life sciences, and I hadn't thought about half of these things. So really appreciated those stimulating ideas. And I hope to be able to talk to you all as part of that to get even more ideas. But so thank you to the audience. I hope you also have learned a lot from this. And thank you to One Nucleus for inviting us all.
Thank you, Karen,
Thank
and
you.
to the
Thank
whole
you. Bye-bye.
panel. That was really interesting, and some really insightful data came out of the discussion as well. I think just a final word for me, it really highlights it's all about integrating and looking at it all the way from discovery to the patient delivery and the wider impact. So thanks once again to the panel for their insights and to the delegates who dropped in. Let's help to keep the discussion going and keep making improvements. I know from a One Nucleus perspective, obviously by having these discussions, we're trying to contribute, but even in how we do things in the office, we're looking at ways to reduce water usage, paper usage, working with our preferred suppliers on the schemes that they're doing to be more carbon friendly. So yeah, all part of playing our part. So once again, thanks all. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.